Hello, welcome to the B.Tech first year course of Guru Nanak Institute of Technology, Kolkata. I'm Dr. Indrajit Bose and I will be your course instructor for this session. This paper is entitled English with a paper code of HU101. In this paper, I shall be guiding you in the basic forms and genres of communication, and we shall be looking at examples from a globalized context as we go along. This is module 3 of the paper and is called Vocabulary and Reading. Throughout the lectures in this module, I shall be looking at purposes of reading, different types of reading strategies, and the way that they are applied to reading texts. We shall also be exploring the 3 reading texts that are there in the syllabus. This is lecture 15 in the series on reading texts 2 and 3. Reading text 2 is by Roald Dahl. It is his short story, Lamb to the Slaughter. During the course of the lecture on this text, I shall be giving a brief introduction to the short story. I shall provide a few words of introduction about the author, Roald Dahl. Then I shall follow this up by a story summary of Lamb to the Slaughter, followed by some brief discussions on different aspects of the story, namely plot and narration, the characters, and the use of humor and irony in the story. Let us begin by looking at the form or the genre of the short story per se. The short story has proved to be an immensely popular form of fiction. It is short fiction, rather, as differentiated from the longer forms like the novel or the novella or longer short story. It is certainly an exquisite piece of art, and it has even been suggested that it is a slice of life presented suggestively. It is, of course, an artistic form which is complete in itself and often has symbols and motifs woven into the story in a kind of complex artistry. Sorry. Usually, the short story has its formal elements quite pronounced. It has a clearly defined setting. It has one or two main characters. A single incident or one or two incidents serve as the turning point in the story. These are mostly the elements which are there in the short story. Also, the deft use of dialogue and other elements is marked feature of the short story. Now, among the masters of the short story, or rather the European masters, we have writers like Maupassant, Anton Chekhov, and O. Henry from the United States. Now, this particular story of Roald Dahl's follows within a subgenre of the short story, rather, the story of suspense or the thriller story. Now, this type of short story involving crime and detection has a fairly long history, going back to the writings of Edgar Allan Poe in the United States in the 19th century, and extending up to the writings of Dashiell Hammett in the early 20th century. Usually, in this type of story, there is a crime and a building up of suspense regarding the identity of the suspected criminal or culprit. And the story may contain, or it may not have, a sleuth who is involved in this whole process of detection. And the finding out of the criminal through a very sophisticated process of detection and reasoning is usually the subject matter of the story. So this particular story of Roald Dahl's falls within this tradition, but as we shall see, it is a very different kind of story. Let us explore further. Okay, now I would like to say a few words about Roald Dahl, the writer. Roald Dahl, who was born in 1916 and died in 1990, was a British novelist, a great children's writer, and a master storyteller. This particular story of his was published in 1953 and it became immensely popular and it was later adapted for the theater, for television, and even for films. In fact, the famous director Alfred Hitchcock adapted the story on the screen. The story really shows Dahl at his best. The ingenious plot and characterization and the superb use of irony and black humor make the story an outstanding one. Now, it has been said that the story was written at the suggestion of Dahl's friend, the writer and creator of James Bond, Ian Fleming. It is said that Fleming said to Dahl, "Why don't you have someone murder their husband with a frozen leg of mutton, which he then serves to the detectives who come to investigate the murder?" This is, in fact, the inception of the story. And from there, Dahl was able to ingeniously develop the story in his own way. And we shall see how deftly patterned with irony the story is. Let us look at the story now. Okay, the summary of the story first. Lamb to the slaughter. Mary Maloney, a housewife, is waiting at home for her policeman husband, Patrick, to come back from work on a winter evening. She is in the 6th month of her pregnancy. Mary is a fairly ordinary housewife. She takes care of her husband and she looks after the house pretty well. She has drawn the curtains. It is a cold winter evening and she's waiting in the silence for her husband. He returns but behaves in a cold and unusual way with her. He then stuns her by the revelation that he is soon going to abandon her and that he is going away. She is temporarily totally stunned, but then she goes to prepare dinner and picks up a joint of frozen lamb which is there in the freezer. Almost in a trance, she comes back to the living room and her husband, Patrick, is standing there. She hits him on the head from the back with the joint, killing him instantly. She then comes out of this state of shock or numbness, which his revelation had temporarily thrown her into, and she realizes full well the consequences of her action. She then puts on an act. She goes to the shops to buy provisions and puts the lamb joint in the oven. In fact, she does everything to conceal the crime as far as possible. So, after spending some time at the shops, she returns home and pretends to find her husband's body and then calls up the police. The policemen who arrive to investigate are Patrick's colleagues and they are sympathetic to her. Mary behaves in a very distressed way. The police are unable to find a murder weapon after a very long and tiring search. So, as it is getting late and the policemen are getting very tired and equally frustrated, Mary suggests that they have a drink and that they also dine at her place. She offers them the lamb, which is by now fully roasted. After initially refusing, the men agree and they sit down to have dinner and they eat the joint of lamb. As the men talk about the missing murder weapon while eating the lamb, Mary laughs secretly. So that is how the story ends. So it is a story not of detection of crime, but rather of concealment of a crime and a very deft and successful concealment of a crime by a very simple, ordinary, and unassuming woman, a housewife who has been betrayed by her husband and kills him in the shock of the moment. And then later, she comes back to her senses and then uh, behaves in a very cunning way and conceals the crime. That is the story, rather. So we can say that it runs counter to the usual story of crime and detection, which the thriller type of genre in the short story had made so popular. Now, let us explore the story further now. Now, a few comments about the plot and narration in the story. Now, Roald Dahl weaves a very tightly knit plot, deftly using the elements of chance, coincidence, suspense, and surprise in the story. The unfolding of the plot is the reverse of the usual thriller story. It is, as I have said, here the identity of the murderer is known, and the suspense lies in how cleverly the crime is concealed. In fact, Mary and the way that she behaves, she provides the ingredients of the perfect murder. The perfect murder, in a sense that it is something which will forever remain concealed. It will never be found out. She will never be discovered. So the plot is extremely tightly woven, very deftly woven, and the elements of chance, coincidence are quite well used. Okay, so is it chance that her husband's colleagues are there for the detection and she is dealing with them and they are hungry and she offers them the leg of lamb as dinner. So there are various elements. Suspense, we are left in suspense as to whether the detectives will discover anything related to the murder or not, but then we find out that that doesn't happen, right? So these are various elements which are woven into the story. Now, what about the narration in the story? The entire narration is in the third person indirect mode. The narrator reveals Mary's thoughts as she comes out of the frozen shock and reveals the entire process in which she logically reasons out her mind, her alibi, and the way that she convinces herself. For instance, at the immediate moment when she kills him, the violence of the crash, the noise, the small table overturning helped her out of the shock. This is just after she has struck the blow that has killed Patrick and he has toppled down to the floor. She came out slowly, feeling cold and surprised, and she stood for a while, blinking at the body, still holding the ridiculous piece of meat tight with both hands. All right, she told herself, so I've killed him. So you see how the insight into her mind is offered. It was extraordinary now how clear her mind became all of a sudden. She began thinking very fast. As the wife of a detective, she knew quite well what the penalty would be. That was fine. It made no difference to her. In fact, it would be a relief. On the other hand, what about the child? What were the laws about murderers with unborn children? Did they kill them both, mother and child, or did they wait until the 10th month? What did they do? Mary Maloney didn't know, and she certainly wasn't prepared to take a chance. So then she acts accordingly, very rapidly and with perfect poise and calculation. So this is the way in which the narration really comes close to the workings of Mary Maloney's mind. And at various critical points, we are given some insight into what she's thinking, what she's planning. Immediately before she goes out to the shops, she stands in front of the mirror and practices saying what she would say to the man in the shops. And she finds that it's not all right. and she's displaying some of the nervousness, or she's displaying some agitation over there, or maybe she's fumbling. So she practices that. She practices a number of times till she is word perfect, and also the emotions are not coming through, and she is perfectly her normal self. So again, the way that she, in a very calculating way, does that, that is brought out. So she is actually, she is very, very ruthless in her own way in what she is doing. So she does not believe in leaving anything to chance whatsoever. She wants to conceal the crime. She has got to conceal the crime to save herself and her unborn child. And she will do anything to be word perfect and also perfect in other ways, so that people are completely deceived. So she will do anything to deceive people. Right. Now, when we go on to talk about the characters, obviously, Mary Maloney is the most important character in the story. And she's quite an interesting character, as a matter of fact. What is most striking about her at the very beginning is that she is very ordinary. Her ordinariness is the most striking feature. She is an ordinary housewife. She is simple, unostentatious, unassuming, and she is devoted to her husband. She is also a very caring wife, till the moment that her husband actually ditches her, or rather, he uh, behaves in a blackguardly way with her. Till that point, she is a very caring wife. She's a very loving wife. And she does everything in her powers to make the home and hearth comfortable for a man who has come back tired from work. This is the picture that we get of her initially. She looks after his every need, attending to his every wish, makes him comfortable, manages the house well. She's a good housewife. Now, when Patrick abandons her, when he actually reveals to her his intention of leaving her, and that too at a very critical stage, so late in her pregnancy, she goes into a complete state of shock and numbness. She is totally numb. We are told what she's thinking. She almost pretends to herself that suppose this hadn't happened, and if she had, if she goes on wishing that, then maybe it will not be true. But of course, that doesn't happen. So uh, she remains in a state of shock as she goes to get the dinner for her husband. And it is in this state of shock that she kills Patrick. She is not really thinking, but is it a premeditated act? That's a question. When she goes down to fetch his dinner, she suddenly finds the leg of mutton. Again, that is one of the chance elements woven into the fabric of the story. And she says to herself, right, she would give him lamb for dinner. Now, there is black comedy over there. She's giving him lamb, she's rather finishing him off with the leg of lamb. So actually, I think at that point, the idea does come into her mind that she is going to carry out this action. So in that sense, she is not totally dazed that as to be able not to think of what she's doing or where she is going next. So I think the idea does come into her mind, but she is not in a very normal state at that point of time. So momentarily, I think she is almost out of herself. She is temporarily insane, or let us say that the murder is committed in a moment of insanity, or rather, she is not in her full senses at that point of time, and she is certainly not her normal self. So she takes the leg of lamb and she kills her husband with it. And as soon as the murder is done, she comes out of that state of shock and numbness which his revelation had thrown her into. And at that point of time, the idea of the enormity of her action begins to sink in. And she realizes that unless she does something to save herself and her child, she is going to face the full penalty of her actions. And being a policeman's wife, she is no stranger to what sort of penalty she's going to face. Now, the thought of herself, and actually rather more than herself, it is her unborn child that prompts her to devise this entire story of a burglary at the house and her husband being killed by unknown assailants while she goes out shopping. So from this point of time, we have a different Mary, not the Mary that we were introduced to at first, who was sewing by the fireside, waiting for her husband to return from work. So we have a different Mary, cold, calculating, remorseless, and hard, pitiless, and she can act in any way that she wants in order to give the alibi that she was out shopping at the time that the murder was committed. So, almost with preternatural cunning, she coaches herself to play a plausible part of an innocent victim. So, she does it extremely well, and she's very, very thorough in what she's doing. So, she goes to the shops, goes through that charade of shopping, coming back, discovering the body, bringing up the police, and playing the part of tearful and shocked wife who has discovered burglary and her murdered husband at the house after coming back to the shops. When we have her colleagues coming to do the detection, so she goes on playing the part with Patrick's colleagues, and again she plays the role of tearful and shocked wife absolutely perfectly. And she also doesn't forget to play the role of hostess. She says that Patrick would never excuse her if she let them go without having anything to eat. So it is only hospitable, and that they should have a bit of dinner with her before they go off. So in an extremely cunning touch, or it's a superb touch rather, she offers them the roast lamb itself as dinner. By mere chance, the lamb which was cooking is done. The roasting is completed in the oven. At this point of time, it's ready to eat. It's late. The officers are hungry. They are not able to go back home right now because they haven't finished the investigation. So she seizes the time and the opportunity offered by the roasted lamb in the oven, and she tells them that they can stay and have dinner with her. That it would only be right and it would only be appropriate to Patrick's memory to have the dinner. Of course, Mary is being extremely hypocritical in behaving like this, but as we know that it is her instinct for survival and her instinct to save her unborn child that is making her behave in this hypocritical and calculating way. So it is a superb touch. So she manages to feed the officers the roast lamb, and this is the last touch in concealing the crime because they are destroying the murder weapon unknowingly while they are having the lamb. Now, when the story ends, Mary is laughing sardonically to herself. She is the victim turned avenger who has triumphed over her foes, the officers who are the agents of the law and the law agents of society. So there is a bit of a question, or we can say that the sanctity of the moral order or the forces of order in society that we take for granted are really interrogated or questioned over here in the story. Patrick is an agent of the law, and he is one of the people holding together the fabric of the moral order of society. And yet, he himself has been obviously having an affair. That too, when he has a devoted wife, and that too, when his wife is in a late stage of pregnancy. So it is extremely shocking. His behavior is extremely shocking, and his decision to abandon his wife at this critical juncture is even more so. So, given that this is the way in which one of the agents of the moral order behaves, then Mary, as a simple and unassuming wife, really has no other option but to turn into an avenger. So she becomes an avenger and she kills her husband. And she also befools the other agents of the moral order, the detectives who have been sent on the case, Patrick's police. So really, she ends up by laughing at society and at the agents of the moral order whom she has quite wittily befooled. And we are given a very negative kind of afternote in the story that the moral order is not able to save the innocent people. So you have to ultimately save yourself in whatever way you can. That is what Mary does. Now, the story is full of black humor and telling irony. Patrick Maloney never dreams that his wife will kill him when he is announcing he is leaving her. So he makes the announcement, and the effect that this announcement has is totally unthought of or undreamt of by him. Now, Mary plays the part of a submissive wife, an innocent victim, when she is with the police officers, but actually she is both an avenger and she is a murderess. So again, there is irony over there. Now, the policeman eating the roast lamb, which is the murder weapon, while they talk about the missing weapon, is also supremely ironical. So this exchange takes place at the very end of the story. So that itself is very, very ironical. So they say, whoever done it, they're not going to be carrying a thing like that around with them longer than they need. Personally, I think it's right here on the premises, probably right under our very noses. What do you think, Jack? And in the other room, Mary Maloney began to giggle. Yes, it is right in that very room, and it is right under their very noses. But they are unaware of it. And therein lies the irony and the black humor in the story. So there are lots of instances of black humor in the story. Mary, when she puts on the act at the shops and she buys a cheesecake for dessert, she has actually given her husband his just desserts, playing the part of innocent wife with the policeman, and also the kind hostess were actually getting rid of the murder weapon. There are lots of instances of black humor in the story. So the story is full of these instances of black humor and irony as well. Finally, I would like to say something about the title of the story. Patrick is unknowingly playing the part of the sacrificial lamb in the story, while Mary is the ritualistic slayer. She is both victim and avenger. And the victim and avenger, in fact, are switching or changing places in this story. Also, the lamb is a gentle and innocent creature. So it is used as a weapon. The leg of the lamb is used as a weapon for a cold-blooded murder. And Mary is an innocent and devoted wife, but suddenly she becomes a calculating and cruel woman when she is cast off by her husband. So we are given the impression that hell had no fury, really, like a woman scorned. So the title of the story is a very ironical title, actually. The victim turns into an avenger, and the custodian of the law himself betrays his faith and trust that he owed to his wife. So the story is full of irony, black humor, and it is an extremely powerful story, giving us an insight into the psychology of a woman who started off as an innocent housewife but became something quite different. Now, I shall be looking at the other reading text 3, that is the extracts from the diary of Anne Frank. Now, before we look at the extracts, I obviously would like to say something about the Second World War, the background to the diary extracts, and the Holocaust which took place. And of course, I would like to say something about Anne Frank and her hiding in the secret annex before going on to talk about her diary and the extracts. So, what was the backdrop in which Anne Frank was writing her diary? The backdrop, of course, is the Second World War, or the events immediately leading to the Second World War, following the rise of Hitler and in Nazi Germany, leading to the systematic discrimination, stigmatization, and the persecution of the members of the Jewish community. Now, who were the Jews? The Jews, of course, were wanderers on the face of the earth, and they formed the trading communities in many different countries. They actually lived in different countries in Europe. Their forefathers had traveled and settled in various countries, and though they belonged to the Jewish faith, they actually formed part of the countries where they inhabited, and they were of those particular nationalities. For example, the Jews living in Germany were German Jews. Those living in Holland were Dutch Jews. And those in France were French Jews, and so on. But of course, their communal bonds were very strong, and they were all united by the Jewish faith which they followed. Now, the persecution of the Jews began in the pre-war years, and it rose to terrifying intensity during the war years. Now, this was done in stages. Around 1933, when Nazism triumphed in Germany and Hitler came to power, a policy of social isolation and attack on the Jewish businesses was initiated through the Nuremberg laws, and particularly on Kristallnacht in 1938, the night where Jewish businesses were burned, set on fire, and various acts of violence were committed against them. Around September 1939, when the Second World War began, the further stage in isolating and persecuting the Jews had begun. The Jews were transferred from the quarters of the towns and cities in which they lived. Often they lived in the affluent suburbs because the Jewish people, those who belonged to the trading communities, were quite affluent and cultured people. So they were transferred to ghettos, often outside the city limits. And then they were gradually moved from there to detention camps, which were specially constructed for holding them. Then the tragedies of the mass killings of the Jews and the deportation to the death camps started. And during the war years, between 1941 to 1945, it has been estimated around 6 million Jews were killed. This is one of the largest genocides in history and one of the greatest tragedies to befall humankind. Now, who was Anne Frank? Now, Anne Frank, of course, was of Jewish faith, and her history is tied up in the history of the Holocaust. She was, to begin with, an intelligent and sensitive 10-year-old child in 1939. She was a German-Dutch girl of Jewish origin. Now, the Frank family was affluent, educated, and a cultured Jewish family, and they moved to Amsterdam from Germany in 1933. Her parents, Otto and Edith Frank, and elder sister Margot, consisted of the rest of the family. It was a small, well-knit, and happy family. Now, when the war began and the persecution of the Jews was increasing day by day, then the Franks were helped by a few of Otto Frank's office colleagues in Amsterdam to go into hiding. So in July 1942, they went into hiding in a concealed part of Otto Frank's office building in Amsterdam. It was cleverly concealed behind a bookcase. There was a small entrance behind there and a very small living quarters. So the entire family went into hiding in this space, which was called the Secret Annex. From 1942 to August 1944, Anne wrote her diary. The whole episode ended with the sudden arrest by the Gestapo, the German police, in August 1944, when the Franks were transported to concentration camps. And Anne Frank died in the camp of Bergen-Belsen in February 1945 of consumption. Her writings and her diary, however, remained, and her diary was immortalized as the diary of a young girl. So she continued to live on many, many years after her death. And it was a great writer who was never able to blossom, but was cut short tragically by the cruelty of the persecution of the Jews during the war. Now we shall look at the diary itself. Now, Anne Frank was given a diary as a present on her 13th birthday. She began keeping a journal. The early entries are very light-hearted and cheerful. She talks about herself, her friends, her school days, and during the internment at the secret annex, or rather, when she went into hiding in the secret annex with her family, and she lived in close confinement for 2 years, more than 2 years, she repeatedly turned to the diary for sustenance, for emotional sustenance and comfort in these years. The diary provides us a record of her daily life in hiding, together with that of her parents and the other family that was with her, the Van Dams. The diary also gives us a record of her blossoming from a sensitive adolescent, from a girl. Now, in spite of negative circumstances, she keeps alive her optimism, energy, and faith. This is what we shall discover when we look at the records or the entries in the diary. Now, there are 3 texts. The first one is the entry of 3rd February 1944. Now, this is the last stage of the Second World War. The tides have already begun turning against Nazi Germany. The Soviet forces are advancing. The Allied landing at Normandy is only a few months away. Now, Anne Frank talks about accounts of newspaper reports and home conversations of projected activities during a possible flooding of Holland by evacuating Germans. So the way that they shall all react against this flood. This is the stuff of her entry. And she talks about it in an extremely humorous kind of way. So possible difficulties of survival in the wake of grim German measures are also talked about. She gives a close account of the conversations that she is hearing among the elders in the secret annex. So the atmosphere of doubt, uncertainty, and confusion is very clearly sketched. The second one that we have, the entry of 12th February 1944, is very different. It's a short and lyrical entry and encapsulates her longings for growth, freedom, and personal space. Words fail her. She wants to cry from an excess of emotion, not grief. Coming to the spring, the coming of the spring finds an echo in her growing restlessness. We have the awakening of a whole body and soul and the evidence of the growth of a young adolescent. But there is also a spiritual awakening. She responds to the call of her inner being. Her inner life is developing counter to the regressive mode of her outer life. There is a feeling of utter confusion and hopelessness as she finds that her freedom is curtailed. The last entry of 13th February, she records another turning point in her life, her first awakening of love for Peter Van Daan. Earlier, she thought that he felt attracted towards his sister Margot, but now she realizes that he is attracted to her. She feels an irresistible attraction and is self-conscious of herself and her feelings. So we have an evidence of her growth and physical and emotional maturity. Now, the entries in the diary that we have provide evidence of life in captivity, which is far removed from the everyday world, and also gives us a record of living in uncertain and troubled times. Yet it is full of love of life, laughter, and feeling. Her ability to understand and appreciate life and its joys and beauties despite adverse circumstances is what carries it through. She is a great writer in spite of being only a young girl on the threshold of adolescence. She gives us a clear impression of her growing maturity as she is writing, that she realizes that things might change for the worse and her life might end, but then the world will still go on. She feels that her death will really make no difference. So it's a tremendous realization for a 12-year-old child or 13-year-old child to have. So this brings us to the end of the discussion on the entries of Anne Frank's diary. So in this lecture, we have been looking at both the prose extracts that we have. One is Roald Dahl's short story, Lamb to the Slaughter, and the other one is the diary of Anne Frank and the three extracts from there. So this brings us to the end of the lecture. Thank you.